You've been told the Roman legions conquered half the world through superior tactics and relentless training. But their real secret was far darker. A system of discipline so brutal and mathematically precise that soldiers feared their own comrades more than the enemy. It was built on a single calculation: 1 in 10 must die. Even today, military academies study Roman discipline as the gold standard of unit cohesion. What they rarely confront is the psychological mechanism behind it, a punishment called decimation, which transformed every squad of 10 men into a self-policing machine of terror. Survival depended not on courage or skill, but on a chilling certainty. If your unit failed, your brothers in arms would beat one of you to death with clubs. The Romans didn't just punish cowards. They engineered a system where failure became statistically lethal for everyone, turning discipline into a shared death sentence. It was so effective, so psychologically devastating, that the threat alone prevented most infractions. Let me show you exactly how decimation worked, why it was terrifyingly efficient, and what happened to the soldier who drew the short straw. Here's how decimation actually worked, and the details matter. When a Roman military unit, usually a cohort of around 500 men or sometimes an entire legion of 5,000, committed an act of cowardice, mutiny, desertion, or catastrophic failure in battle, the commanding general would order decimation. The unit would be divided into groups of 10 men. Their contubernium or tent group, the 8 to 10 soldiers who lived together, fought together, and shared every aspect of military life. Each group would draw lots. Straws, stones marked with charcoal, wooden tokens. The method varied, but the principle was absolute. 1 man in 10 would be marked for execution, not the guiltiest, not the leader, not the worst soldier. Just 1 in 10, selected purely by chance. And here's where the mathematical brutality becomes clear. The 9 survivors would be handed clubs and stones, and they would be required to beat their chosen comrade to death in front of the assembled legion. If they refused, if they showed mercy, if they didn't strike with sufficient violence, they would be marked for execution themselves. The system forced men who had shared meals and marched hundreds of miles together to become executioners, ensuring that the psychological trauma of decimation infected the entire unit, not just the victims. The earliest recorded decimation happened in 471 BCE, when the consul Appius Claudius ordered it for troops who had fled from the Volsci. But the practice reached its most infamous implementation under Marcus Licinius Crassus during the Third Servile War against Spartacus in 71 BCE. Crassus inherited an army that had been repeatedly defeated by gladiator slaves, and humiliation so profound that Roman military pride was shattered. When troops under his command broke and fled from a minor skirmish, Crassus immediately ordered decimation, not of a single cohort but of an entire legion. 500 men selected by lottery, beaten to death by their brothers in arms. Ancient historians record that the screams could be heard for miles, and that soldiers who survived bore psychological scars that never healed. But here's the chilling part: it worked. That legion never broke again. They went on to defeat Spartacus's army and crucified 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way. The mathematical exchange was clear. 500 Roman lives purchased the combat effectiveness of an entire legion. And from the Roman command perspective, that was an acceptable transaction. This is the part military historians rarely emphasize when they discuss Roman discipline. Decimation wasn't about justice. It was about statistics. Roman commanders understood something about human psychology that modern militaries often try to ignore. Individual punishment for individual crimes doesn't create unit cohesion. It creates resentment. But collective punishment, where the guilty and innocent die together, creates something far more powerful: a shared sense of vulnerability that binds survivors together and makes them desperate to ensure their unit never fails again. When you know that your tentmate's cowardice might result in your random execution, you don't just encourage bravery, you enforce it. You watch every man in your contubernium constantly. You intervene at the first sign of weakness. You create a self-regulating system where peer pressure isn't just social, it's existential. The genius of decimation was that it outsourced discipline from commanders to the soldiers themselves, making every man responsible for policing the behavior of 9 others. But here's where the system becomes even more psychologically sophisticated. The Romans didn't use decimation frequently. Records suggest it happened perhaps a dozen times across 5 centuries of republican and imperial history. It was rare enough to be shocking, common enough to be credible. Every soldier had heard the stories. Every recruit knew the stakes. The threat of decimation hung over every military decision like a mathematical sword, and that threat was often more effective than the act itself. Commanders would invoke it explicitly. Before risky battles, centurions would remind their men, fail here and the entire cohort faces decimation. The calculation became simple: the enemy might kill you. Failure would definitely kill 1 in 10 of your brothers, and you might be that one. The rational choice was to fight with suicidal determination, because the statistical risk of dying in combat was actually lower than the guaranteed 10% mortality rate of decimation. Now understand what this did to the internal dynamics of a Roman military unit. Trust and solidarity are supposedly the foundation of military effectiveness. Brothers in arms who would die for each other. But decimation poisoned that trust in a very specific way. It created a dual psychology where you simultaneously depended on your tentmates for survival and knew they would kill you without hesitation if the lottery selected you. Historical accounts describe the aftermath of decimations where survivors couldn't look at each other, where men who had beaten their friends to death would wake screaming from nightmares, where entire units would go months without speaking except when duty required it. The psychological damage was permanent, yet these traumatized units often became the most reliable in the Roman army. They never broke, they never fled, they never mutinied. Because the terror of decimation had been burned into their souls so deeply that death in battle seemed preferable to risking it again. The evidence for decimation's effectiveness is undeniable. After Crassus's decimation in 71 BCE, that legion became one of the most feared fighting forces in Roman history. When Julius Caesar threatened decimation for units that failed during the Gallic Wars, those units never failed again. The threat alone was sufficient. During the Roman civil wars, generals who employed or threatened decimation consistently had more disciplined armies than those who relied on traditional punishment methods. The statistical correlation is clear. Armies that used decimation-based discipline had lower rates of desertion, mutiny, and battlefield panic than armies that didn't. From a pure military effectiveness standpoint, decimation worked. It produced soldiers who would hold formation against impossible odds, who would march into certain death without hesitation, who valued unit cohesion above their own survival. The cost was their humanity, but Roman military doctrine didn't account for humanity. It accounted for victory. Here's the part that should disturb you most. The mathematical logic of decimation didn't die with Rome. It resurfaced throughout military history whenever commanders needed to restore discipline through terror. During World War I, French and British forces used firing squads to execute soldiers selected, pour encourager less orders, to encourage the others. Not quite decimation, but the same principle. Kill some to terrify all. The Soviet Red Army during World War II used blocking detachments that would shoot their own soldiers if they retreated, creating a mathematical certainty that retreat was more dangerous than advancing into German machine guns. North Korean military doctrine allegedly still includes collective punishment systems where entire units face consequences for individual failures. The logic of the 10th man, sacrifice the few to control the many, keeps reappearing because from a purely operational standpoint, it works. Armies that use collective punishment systems often do have lower desertion rates and higher unit cohesion, at least in the short term. The long-term psychological cost to survivors is catastrophic, but military doctrine rarely measures long-term psychological cost. It measures whether soldiers obey orders and hold their positions. But there's a crucial detail about Roman decimation that reveals why it eventually disappeared from official Roman military practice. It only worked when soldiers believed in the cause they were fighting for. During the Republic, when legionaries were citizen soldiers defending Rome itself, decimation could be employed because the underlying military culture was strong enough to absorb the trauma. Men who had been decimated would still fight because they were fighting for their families and their city. But during the late Empire, when legions were increasingly composed of mercenaries and barbarian foederati who had no cultural connection to Rome, decimation stopped working. When Emperor Maximian tried to use it against Christian soldiers in the Theban legion around 286 CE, the legion refused to execute their brothers and accepted mass execution instead. The system broke down because decimation only functions when soldiers value their military identity more than their individual lives. When that cultural foundation erodes, the mathematical logic of collective punishment collapses, and you're left with nothing but murder. The historical record contains dozens of accounts of Roman decimations, and they share common elements that reveal the psychological machinery at work. The selection process was always public and ritualized. Lots would be drawn in front of the assembled legion. The condemned would be given a few hours to say goodbye, to settle debts, to write letters home. Then the execution would happen at sunset, timed so the screams and the sickening sounds of clubs striking bone would echo through the camp as darkness fell. The survivors would be required to watch. Junior officers would circulate to ensure no one looked away. And afterward, the decimated unit would be placed on barley rations instead of wheat, a symbolic degradation that marked them as less than full citizens until they could redeem themselves through exceptional performance in the next battle. Every element was calculated to maximize psychological impact, to ensure that decimation wasn't just punishment but transformation. Units that survived decimation were supposed to emerge as something different, something harder, something that had passed through death and come out willing to do anything to avoid going through it again. If you're thinking this sounds like systematic psychological torture dressed up as military discipline, you're absolutely right. That's exactly what it was. The Romans understood that human psychology could be weaponized, that mathematical certainty of punishment was more effective than proportional justice, and that soldiers who had killed their own brothers would never break unit cohesion because they were bound together by shared guilt that could never be forgiven or forgotten. Modern military psychology has extensive research on what happens to soldiers forced to commit atrocities against their own side. The rates of post-traumatic stress, major depression, and suicide are catastrophically high. The survivors of Roman decimation would have experienced all of this, but they experienced it in a culture that had no concept of psychological trauma as something to be treated or acknowledged. They just carried it, suppressed it, and channeled it into savage effectiveness on the battlefield. The mathematical elegance of the system is what makes it so disturbing. 10% mortality creates just enough terror to be universally felt without depleting military strength significantly. If you executed half the unit, you destroy its combat capability. If you executed 1 in 100, the threat would feel remote and abstract. But 1 in 10. That's close enough that every soldier knows multiple victims personally, distant enough that most survive to carry the lesson forward. It's the optimal point on a curve of terror versus utility, and the Romans found it through trial and error over centuries of military practice. They didn't have psychological research or statistical modeling. They just had empirical observation. 1 in 10 works and other ratios don't work as well. The fact that they arrived at this number through practical experience makes it even more chilling, because it suggests that the psychological breaking point of human beings under collective punishment is consistent and measurable. Here's what happened to the practice in the long term. As Rome transitioned from republic to empire, as legions became professional standing armies rather than citizen militias, decimation became increasingly rare. Not because commanders became more humane, but because the cost-benefit analysis changed. Professional soldiers were expensive to train and maintain. Executing 10% of a legion meant losing years of training investment and institutional knowledge. Alternative punishment methods emerged: flogging, extra duties, dishonorable discharge, that preserved manpower while still maintaining discipline. By the late Empire, decimation had largely disappeared from Roman military practice, remembered more as a historical horror than a current policy. But the psychological principle survived. Military units still used shame, collective punishment, and the threat of consequences that fell on the innocent as well as the guilty. The specific mechanism of killing 1 in 10 was gone, but the underlying logic, use mathematical certainty of group punishment to create self-regulating discipline, remained embedded in military culture. The definitive truth about Roman decimation is that it was never about justice, morality, or even really about punishment. It was a technology of control that used statistical violence and psychological manipulation to transform groups of individual soldiers into something more useful to the state. A collective organism that valued unit survival over individual life, that would kill its own members to preserve group cohesion, and that had been so thoroughly traumatized that obedience became the only psychologically tolerable option. The 10th man didn't die because he was guilty. He died because his death purchased compliance from the 9 who survived, and those 9 survivors didn't become better soldiers because they learned a lesson. They became effective soldiers because they had been psychologically shattered and rebuilt in a shape that served Roman military objectives. The chilling logic of decimation is that it worked exactly as designed, and the fact that it worked tells us something uncomfortable about human psychology. That we are malleable enough, that our social instincts are powerful enough, that we can be engineered into killing our friends if the alternative is our own random execution. If this investigation into the mathematical brutality of Roman military discipline has shown you that history is far darker than the sanitized versions taught in schools, make sure you're subscribed to Mythbusting, because we're going to keep pulling back the curtain on the systems of control that empires used to maintain power. The machinery of civilization has always run on mechanisms we'd rather not examine too closely, but understanding them is essential to recognizing when similar patterns emerge in modern contexts. The Romans didn't invent collective punishment or the psychology of terror. They just perfected it to a degree that still makes military historians uncomfortable 2,000 years later. So what dark historical system should we dissect next? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep uncovering the uncomfortable truths that traditional narratives prefer to leave buried.